you're dealing with music, it's not a shock that you get some ghosts as well. I don't think.
Well, you know,
Yeah,
how many musicians
right.
die sudden
With
deaths?
what happened with me was that I started to write about local ghost legends, and I'll just be honest with you, I didn't have enough to fill out an 800,000, 1,200 word feature story.
Mm-hmm.
So as a student at Penn State, I remembered that there were some ghost stories from Penn State, and that's when I looked into those stories. And what I found was just, literally stories that were 120 years old, tons of stories. I realized at that point that there were probably more stories per square meter in a university campus than there were on some of these battlefields like Gettysburg and whatnot. So that kind of piqued my interest, mainly because, and full disclosure, I'm a science and research writer full time for Penn State. So there's a huge dichotomy between this idea of ghosts on campus with this sort of hyper-rational scientific side of students. And that intrigued me, like how does that exist in the campus? And so, as I'm writing these, I try to write them as entertaining as possible. I try to leave myself out of it, my own beliefs out of it, and really let all sides kind of tell the story. But, when I'm doing these stories and when I'm researching it, all these things kind of bubble up that make me, as someone who's interested in religion and philosophy, kind of delve a little deeper into it. And I try to get into that in the books without coming off, kind of as a nerdy professor type. But that's kind of how I take that material.
It's something you do, and we were talking about it just before we went on air, that I think a lot of writers like you forget is, even setting aside from an objective scientific standpoint, the ghosts exist or don't they, the stories themselves do constitute folklore.
Yes.
And that's, folklore is something, at least in my opinion, is something important to record and maintain, because it says something about our culture and our thoughts at the time.
No, I totally agree with that. If someone tomorrow would prove that ghosts absolutely don't exist, and that all the people that came up to me and told me their ghost stories were, either lying to me or they were misidentifying natural phenomena, then I would still say that this is very important stuff. And with the ghost stories on university campuses, they actually perform kind of an interesting role, at least in my opinion. What they do is actually they give history lessons to a crowd of people, a population that I consider transitory, because students come on campus and they leave campus. So it does that. It offers moral stories. Some of them, I think, are cautionary tales about areas to avoid and behaviors to avoid. So if all of that, if it was proven it wasn't true, I would still be very intrigued with folklore and ghost lore. And the way I approach it is I always include ghost lore and folklore, but I also use ghost accounts of ghost stories, which are people who have actually had run-ins with things they can't explain.
Yeah. Well, it's like the role of what you were saying. It's like the role of mythology and folklore in society. That's sort of what it serves, is to provide context for things or explanations for mysterious happenings, or sometimes, like you said, cautionary tales. And
well, even historical, the things we more commonly think of as fairy tales and folklore, Brothers Grimm and things like that. These days, we just see them as fiction. Back in the day, that was something people believed happened. And I think probably in a lot of, maybe not every single case, but a lot of the cases, it's somebody's eyewitness account that's gotten exaggerated or changed, or it's ghost stories of an older day, basically.
Yeah, or urban legends, or...
It doesn't validate we're not necessarily saying a wolf, put on grandma's dress, but the story, to somebody writing that down from the first account, secondhand accounts.
Well, maybe originally the wolf was a murderer.
Yeah.
A human wolf, essentially.
Even if you read some of the werewolf, the actual accounts, werewolves are definitely a creature we think of as myth.
Yeah.
But if you read,
Mhm.
there are accounts of people who were captured, tried, and executed as werewolves.
Mm-hmm.
And when you read the accounts of the accusations and the crimes they were supposed to have committed, they sound like modern day serial killers.
Well, they were. That was the explanation that people at that time had because they couldn't fathom why someone would behave that way unless they were sort of cursed by a demon or possessed or something like that.
And ghosts just fill. What happens next after we die is probably the most fundamental question every human in history has had to grapple with at some point.
I mean, it's one of the reasons why religion exists is to answer that question, and things like where does lightning come from and how does natural phenomenon happen.
Right. And I'll also interject and say that a lot of what I do when I analyze this is, what do you put on the table as a writer? And it's easy to just use folklore and just use examples of kind of obvious ghost lore, folklore, whatever you want to call it, legends. But then you can also have people who've had real, they've had encounters with things they can't explain, and to put that on the table. And what you find is there is a lot of both and, not either or. So it doesn't have to be either folklore or real ghost stories. And what happens naturally when people read about these accounts is they kind of go towards their biases. In other words, they're going to start taking things off the table to go along with their own biases. I have friends who are skeptics and they think it's all folklore and ghost lore, and then I have friends who and readers who are total believers, and they believe even kind of those outlandish folklore. So that's what I kind of find interesting about the whole exploration of this area.
It's trying to walk that middle ground between, I certainly believe in ghosts. I've had many experiences, but there's any sane investigator, in my experience, realizes there are plenty of cases where it is naturally occurring phenomenon, or the person had one too many at the bar last night, or there's some mundane explanation for it. And it's very hard at times to stand in the middle, because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that there's one thing that each side hates more than the other. It's the guy that's somewhere in between.
Yeah.
Right.
And I agree. I mean, the story, maybe there's truth to it. I think there is at least in some of the cases. Maybe there isn't in some of the cases. There are probably things that are legend. I mean, when I went to university, we had our ghost stories too. Some of them, had some legitimacy to them. At least one of them was, I did some background checking old microfiches and things like that. Because there's a Bolton building on campus, supposedly a student hanged themselves. Can't find a record of anyone actually hanging themselves there.
Right, and that's something that would be documented,
Yeah.
So there's probably always a mix, but it's interesting the point that you made about how sometimes these stories that you find actually become a barometer of the people reading them. That's like how people react. And that's really interesting. The fact that you can almost learn something about the people that read your work based on how they react to it.
It's also, when you look at country and you look at rock, there are definitely supernatural elements in a great many songs.
Yeah.
The most obvious that jumps to mind, one of many people's favorite country songs, "Devil Went Down to Georgia."
Oh yeah, that is a lot of fun.
I have met so many friends that hate country music that love that song.
Well, because it's almost not a country song. It's like it's got elements, but it transcends a particular genre. It's got a sort of appeal that's.
It's also just that good.
Yeah, it's a very well written song. It's very catchy, and it's just a lot of fun. It's a fun. toe tapping song.
And also remember that legend is really an outgrowth of the legend of Robert Johnson and doing the deal with the devil.
I was just going to mention that.
Classic,
the blues
blues
guitarist.
legend. So they're very correlated.
Yeah.
And Johnson certainly said, and I mean, blues had a strong influence on country, and Johnson's had a strong influence on rock and country and pretty much everything else today.
Well, the blues very much influenced rock and roll as well as country. I mean, the Beatles, I think, even said that if there hadn't been, if it hadn't been for the American blues, there never would have been a Beatles.
Yeah, that's true. With the way I look at it and the way I've kind of analyzed at least the role of supernatural in rock and roll and in country music is that, one of the questions that a lot of people ask me is, since I wrote, and I can kind of give you a background on how this all sort of emerged, is that after I was done with my university book, the acquisition editor said, "Oh, do you have anything else?" And I was reading R. Gary Patterson's book, Take a Walk on the Dark Side. And R. Gary Patterson, who just recently passed away, has always been kind of a hero to me because he explored this, a lot of the supernatural and the occult legends of music, blues and rock and roll. And I just kind of blurted out haunted rock and roll. And I really had no clue whether I would have. I mean, here's a guy who could barely put, enough ghost stories in a 1,200-word feature story, and all of a sudden I'm kind of spontaneously saying I can do a book on ghosts of rock and roll. So I was a little afraid that I wasn't going to pull this off, but within the first few weeks, I had just found dozens and dozens and dozens of stories. Everyone from, the ghost of Jim Morrison, Janis Joplin, Buddy Holly, and to Elvis, to even the Beatles, to some modern rock legends like Kurt Cobain and Amy Winehouse.
Oh, wow.
So I was astounded at the volume. In fact, I'm working on more haunted rock and roll, which I hope to have out in the spring, because I just had so much.
Oh, wow. That's great.
Yeah, it's just a fun. I mean, I keep finding more and more as I look in, and so I thought there has to be something special about rock and roll that would kind of create the amount of supernatural legends around it. And so, one of the ideas that I came out with is just that. So then I thought it must be special because of rock and roll, but I had some little snippets of ghost stories about Johnny Cash, ghost stories about Hank Williams, Patsy Cline, and so I started researching country music, and I found just as many ghost stories from that era, from the country genre, as I did haunted rock and roll. And so what I came away with this was that it isn't just rock and roll that's special. It's really music, and music is this tool for transcendence. And I think that's why, that's why I did going on 3 books on the ghosts of, music legends. I'm not doing the ghosts of science writers or the ghosts of accountants or anything like that.
That would be a hell of a book to read, though.
Yeah, right. I'll start working on that next.
I'm sure that's.
It's a sure, it's like I'm sitting here trying to think, and it's like, well, there's Edison's telephone to the dead, and people have seen Jefferson hanging around once in a while, and
but I think
that's about it.
I think it makes sense because musicians, especially in those areas, are very passionate people, and one of the things from hanging out with Kevin and hearing all of this stuff about ghosts is one of the common elements that seems to keep presenting is that ghosts are in some form of way creatures of passion, either something that was left undone or something that, just some force of personality that remains. and it seems like yeah, it would draw those kinds of people.
Also, realistically, if you were an accountant, would you want to come back and keep doing it for all of eternity?
Yeah, no, you're not going to stick around.
I don't think anyone in the world is that much of a math geek.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there are some elements that for me tie the ghost stories in and the supernatural legends in with music. And one of them is, as you suggested, when you talk about music stars, you talk about, you use words like, larger tthan life, iconic, the king of rock and roll, immortal, he's immortalized, and all these things. So you do have that element. I think the other thing is, at least, I'd say with rock and roll especially, but maybe country music as well, is the tragedies that befall rock musicians and country musicians. And I'm thinking about people like Jim Morrison and Elvis to some extent,
Kurt
Hank
Cobain,
Williams, people like that. So they have these kind of tragic lives that, from what I normally do is I bring in paranormal investigators and researchers and ask them about these things because they're really the experts in that area. And, they talk a lot about this, these tragedies kind of almost embedding the spirit into this kind of time and space that gets repeated. So that comes up a lot. And I think the other thing is just that if you look at most spiritual practices, most religions, they use music.
Oh, very much so.
Part of the worship services.
Bring that up.
Some of the oldest religions in the world. The shamanistic religions, the animism of Africa.
Yeah.
Drum beats, music is such an important part. Even in Christianity, gospel music, spirituals. Yep. There's parts of the Bible that talk about the angels that stand around God singing glory, glory, glory.
Yeah. Well, I think wasn't there a scientific or some sort of a study I remember reading where there's a similarity in the brain waves to like meditation and prayer as there is when
relaxing music.
When you get right. Really into music or when you're singing and things like that. Like there's a similar effect.
And all through folklore, religion and folklore too, for that matter. From a paranormal standpoint, when I'm on a demonic case, one of the things that we always dread is the sound of chimes. Because chimes is traditionally, and from experience, can be a sign that something more powerful is being summoned. There's an unquestioned, and also from a practical standpoint, math is the language of the universe. It's what lets us understand physics. It's what forms our rational basis for almost everything that we can rationally say we know. And music is mathematics.
Yeah, there's a big correlation between mathematics and music.
Well, yeah, and
harmonies.
The way a lot of musicians explain it to me is that it's almost like a whole brain meditation, because you're obviously you're doing the math calculations, whether you're talking about the rhythms that you're counting out, or the frequencies of the notes and the frequencies of the notes matching to the harmonies. So there's all of that, and plus you have this kind of creative side, this improvisational side, where you're kind of tapping into the spirits, which is what inspiration means.
Yeah.
Yeah. And again, it's such a common element. The power of sound, the power of music is such a fundamental concept. In the Bible, when the Israelites march around the cities of Jericho for 7 days with the ark, and then they sound the trumpets to bring the walls down.
Right.
It's hard to avoid this concept, and on a more fundamental and on a personal level, there is the meditative, even I think in the best of times, musicians would say transcendent state of creating music.
Oh yeah.
But there's also that state that we can have all of us, even tone deaf people, people who couldn't carry a tune in a bucket, like me. I mean, I can't play any instruments, nor can I sing. But when you listen to a really glorious piece of music, it transports you in a very fundamental way. That, I mean, you could we could sit and show the brain scans all we want, but I don't personally believe we entirely understand on an objective level.
Right. Yeah, I'd agree. I would agree.
So, are there any particularly good stories? Like maybe you could pull one from the upcoming book and kind of give us a sneak preview of a particularly cool anecdote that you got of a rock musician.
Well, I have, there are a lot, and I keep finding more and more. But in Haunted Rock and Roll, I talk one of the more fascinating and almost comedic is the stories about Jim Morrison's ghost. And
I can believe that for knowing a little bit about Jim Morrison and his life and personality. Yeah, I can kind of believe that.
Right, and his background is he was probably the only person that I researched that essentially said he was possessed by ghosts, because it's kind of a legendary moment in rock history when he and his family were traveling through the Southwest. His dad was a naval officer and was getting restationed all the time, and so he was kind of a Navy brat. And on one of those trips, he passed a accident I think he was in New Mexico, and as he was passing by, there were a group of Native Americans who were in the car accident who died. And he said as the car passed, he felt their spirits inhabit him. And from that point on, if you look at his music and his lyrics and in his shows, they were very shamanistic, and he references that all the time. So that's kind of this piece of folklore, ghost lore, rock lore, whatever you want to call it. But then there are these stories about the places that he lived in. In fact, in the new book, I'm going to be talking about there are ghost stories in a house that he lived in New Mexico that the owner believes is related to Jim Morrison living there as a young boy. And in the Haunted Rock and Roll book, I talk about a ghost story that happened in when he lived in a town near D.C. He lived in a house there, and the woman in that house claimed that one night she was sleeping and woke up, and she looked at the foot of her bed, and there was Jim Morrison with this kind of ethereal glow around him, and that she was frightened, of course, and so she closed her eyes, and she felt this body come into the bed next to her. She could feel the bed, compressed down, and she looked over, and she was staring face to face with Jim Morrison, again with this kind of ethereal, look about him. So that's a person who's had a personal experience that they can't explain, doesn't think it's hallucination. She actually went to the press about it. Mm-hmm. So I included that in the book. And the other kind of amusing one about Jim is that apparently he haunts the bathroom of a Mexican restaurant. So
yeah.
I would think that he would be in a roadhouse, but maybe the Lizard King liked his burritos, I guess.
Could be.
Maybe it had some special significance for him or something.
Or maybe it was built on top of something else.
It could be, yeah. There might be something that was there before.
Looking into it a little further, the bathroom was actually the vocal booth for the studio where the Doors recorded a lot of their songs. Okay. So
that would explain.
So there is that connection.
Good acoustics in that bathroom.
Some of the phenomena are that at times the room seems to breathe. Mm-hmm. You can hear, inhales and exhales. And that's very much what I would suggest would be happening in a vocal booth as you're getting, you're listening to the music and you're getting ready to sing.
Oh yeah,
Then
exercises.
the doors kind of rattle. So you really have the full gamut with Jim. I just love his stories.
Okay, so we're coming up on the first half hour. I want to take a minute to get the phone number out and just catch everybody up. So if anybody wants to call in with a question for Matt, the number is 609-807-2492, 609-807-2492. I want to remind folks, if anyone does opt to call in, since we had the caller who forgot or didn't know last week, you need to turn off or at least pause the video stream if you're going to call, because there's a delay between the stream and you coming through.
Yes.
And it's going to be a gobbledygook mess otherwise.
Yeah, don't listen while you call in.
If you really want to listen to yourself when you're on the air, we'll have the video up in a couple of weeks on YouTube. You can watch it there anyway. But again, 609-807-2492. I want to remind everybody listening to HamiltonRadio.net, Channel 2, because I forgot to say that at the beginning.
Yep.
And this is Paranormal Encyclopedia. We're talking to Matt Swayne, author of Haunted Rock and Roll and Ghosts of Country Music.
See, I'd be really interested if we could talk to Jim Morrison. I'd be curious to find out what he thought of the Oliver Stone movie.
I don't think he would be able to reach out.
Yeah.
What did you think? Did Val Kilmer, get it right?
It's kind of what you
right.
I think that's what we all wonder about these famous people. It's like,
yeah.
What does Elvis think of the Million Impersonators?
Well, the impersonators, the various movies that have been made about him. Yeah,
the endless speculation that he's not really dead.
Yeah, you got to wonder about stuff like that.
So Matt, you've written the book, so you'd be the one to know. Is Elvis really dead, and have you seen him lately?
The famous
Ghostbusters. That's actually a great way to kind of wrap up some of the stuff that we were talking about as far as folklore and real ghost stories, because Elvis runs the gamut. In haunted rock and roll, I think he's the king of haunted rock and roll because his ghost is seen across the country in all these places that Elvis made famous or are part of the Elvis legend. So his ghost has been seen in Graceland. It's been seen in the Grand Ole Opry. There are places, I know that we briefly discussed whether there might be a Gold LeMay Elvis out there, a ghost of Elvis out there. And there are ghost stories in several hotels in Las Vegas. I think the Grand Hilton might be one of them. And there is definitely a jumpsuit Elvis in one of those hotels. So when I was getting into these Elvis ghost stories, and again, I have a pretty skeptical mind when it comes to it. The thing is that you have, first of all, maybe Elvis didn't die because that was a huge kind of 1970s urban legend that, he's working at a, Burger King, in Indiana somewhere.
In a trailer park. Because why, give up the millions and the ranch and this fame and all that so that you can go flip burgers.
Right.
That makes sense.
Right.
Well, there's always the one movie Bruce Campbell did.
Oh, yes, Bubba Hotep.
Where Elvis switched places with an impersonator who's the one who died. And winds up in an old folks' home.
And he fights a mummy with JFK, whose brain has been put in the body of Ozzie Davis.
Yeah.
It's a fantastic movie.
What movie is this?
It's called Bubba Hotep.
Bubba Hotep.
As in Southern. Yeah, it is hilarious.
Bruce Campbell as Elvis and Ozzie Davis as JFK in a wheel.
I'll loan it to you sometime. I have it. It's fantastic.
That sounds amazing.
Anyway, no. The reason I asked is I was curious if there was a commonality as far as, because you figure, okay, when somebody becomes a ghost, they have a certain. Usually they have a particular look, like, a self-image or whatever that they take on. And I was wondering, like, how would Elvis sort of see himself? Would he see himself as he was at the time of his death? Would he, make himself back, look back the way he was when he was in his 20s? Which
Right.
Which version
Well,
of himself would he be?
Right. And in the Elvis ghost lore, it runs the gamut, because there's a ghost story about a truck driver who picks up Elvis, and he's a young Elvis. He's like he's 18, 19. His ghost has been seen in the balconies of some New Orleans hotels in the French Quarter, and he looks like, that kind of hillbilly cat, King Creole type Elvis. In Las Vegas, he's the, big glitzy, big belt buckled Elvis.
See, I think those are ghosts of impersonators.
Right. Well, that's the interesting thing is you have is Elvis even dead? That's one of them. Then you have all these Elvis impersonators. Are people mistaking these Elvis impersonators for the ghost? And then you have the one ghost story that seems to come up quite a bit is that there right after Elvis died, some people in the public were allowed to go on Graceland tour, but it was nothing like the very regimented tour. I don't know whether if you've ever gone to it, but it's a very they bring you in as a group and they take you room to room, only certain rooms.
Right.
They really cleaned up the jungle room, which just kind of made me sad. But in any event, this early on, you were allowed to kind of go through the grounds as you wanted to, and these folks were going through, and they actually took a picture of what looks like Elvis Presley sitting behind a door, a glass door, or maybe a screen door of the pool house. And so, is it Elvis is alive? Is it Elvis's ghost? Is it an impersonator? Or Elvis hung out with about 7 guys, the Memphis Mafia, who dressed like him, talked like him, wore similar sunglasses. So is it one of those folks that is a picture of? So when you really get into doing this Elvis ghost lore, really what you have to do is put everything on the table and let people pick off what they want.
I would say
so that's kind of what I did with that.
Yeah.
There's another option I would stick on the table. There's a concept in Eastern mysticism, and to some extent in Western magic, of what they call Tulpa or egregore. The idea
that was going to be the next thing I wanted to discuss.
There we go.
We're great minds.
We're professionals. That's why we have a show.
All right, that's the one where if everybody focuses on it hard enough, it essentially exists, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yep.
Or even if just one person focuses on it enough in some cases.
Well, considering how widespread the Elvis thing would be, it would have to be multiple people. And essentially, the more people believe, it's kind of like starting an urban legend. And then...
and he has millions of fans to this day that are so dedicated. Yeah. People who are absolutely convinced he's still alive. If anybody was going to generate a tulpa, I think it would be Elvis.
Yeah, it does make sense.
Yeah, and so, I'll jump back to the university ghost story because I think it's kind of instructive of what we're talking about here, because I don't have, you probably have far more experience in this than I do, but so I wrote this Ghosts of Penn State book, and one of the ghost stories that I wrote about is a building called Old Botany, and it fits your great stereotypical haunted house. It's the oldest standing building on campus. There's a grave right across the street. It kind of looks like it might be haunted. And lo and behold, there's a bunch of ghost stories about it, which I really considered these ghost stories to be ghost lore. In fact, nothing more than just folklore and legends about it. And as I said, that's great. I'm going to put that in, and it's interesting in that level. But then after I wrote the book, and it always happens after you write the book, you get witnesses. Not when you needed them 6 months before that. But I had a janitor tell me 3 stories, and full disclosure, I'm very easily freaked out.
Yeah, me too.
You and Brian are the.
And so, So he told me a few stories that just really gave me chills. And he was so serious that he asked to be, so he used to come in on the night shift around 11 o'clock and clean up old botany from 11 to 3 or 4 and then go to another building, I think was what he told me. And he was so scared of this place that he asked to be relieved from that and took on a bigger building, I think he told me.
Yeah.
So one of the stories he told me was that he was vacuuming and he just finished and he clicked off the sweeper and he heard this horrible crash of what sounded like glass and he figured someone was breaking into the building. Mm-hmm. So he quickly ran to the room, opened up the room, and it was completely empty. And the second he opened the door, the noise stopped. So what I don't think he knew, he couldn't figure it out because when he opened up the door, it was an office building. But what I found out later was the room I think that he was describing was actually a lab and would have had beakers and test tubes and things like that. And it was old botany, so it was probably, plants and things like that there. So, it made me think how much could ghost lore turn into real ghost accounts? And then could ghost accounts turn into more ghost lore? Yeah. And so you have almost like a cyclical thing.
Well, you have to wonder. I mean, from an investigator standpoint, you have to wonder about that kind of thing. And it's like, the lines blur the more when you get into some of the weirder stuff. The popular urban legend, technically originally fake lore, then urban legend, and maybe more of what's his name, Slender Man.
Oh yeah.
And that now I'm starting to get reports that maybe we've got Otopa. Mm-hmm. Or just something thought the story was funny and decided I'll try being this for a while.
Yeah. Which, that wouldn't surprise me in either case, especially some of the crazy that we have just on the East Coast alone. Yeah. However, we actually have a question from one of the people watching.
Okay, great.
From a Chuck Lemon.
I guess from last week, in fact.
Yes, Chuck. Is the ghost of Elvis more often seen in restaurants looking for a good ham sandwich? With a big old smiley face.
No, bacon, peanut butter, and banana.
Yes.
That was the midnight snack. Everybody knows that. Ham was for breakfast.
The ham sandwich, I believe, is included in the ghost lore of Mama Cass. But if you read Haunted Rock and Roll, I debunked the myth that she died because she choked on a ham sandwich. So
that's
at least I think her ghost is happy that I cleared that up.
So let's resolve one of those.
That's been a long myth about her. One thing before I forget, as far as the people coming forward after the book, I was going to suggest that's what a revised edition is for. You can always write up a nice little appendix and put out a
here's all the stuff we found out since the first edition.
Yeah, exactly. So there you go. You get to
that's a great idea.
Keep it current.
Yeah.
And it's the thing with this kind of subject. It's like, every author I've ever talked to in the paranormal, and when some of the times when I've had guests on the show, it's like a dozen things come up afterwards.
Well, yeah, by the time you publish the book, it's already like out of date. I mean, that happens with a lot of fields.
Well, just as you're saying as well, you've got more ghosts of rock and roll coming up because what do you know? There's more stories.
There's so much to cover, but always good.
Yeah.
So
the hard part I'm having with this more haunted rock and roll book is that I keep stumbling on more and more stories. So I'm trying to get them all sussed out.
There you go.
Trying to avoid turning this into the encyclopedia of haunted music.
It's not a bad gig if you can get it.
We're due for one actually.
Yeah.
But anyway, let's get back to Chuck's question about the ham sandwich before we tangent too much. I don't want him to go without his answer.
Things we need to know.
I don't know. I'm trying to think offhand of any ghost stories where he's at a restaurant, but I know his ghost was seen in Graceland, and there's another one where he's haunted and this is where it crosses with the ghost stories of country music. When he was in the Grand Ole Opry, apparently his spirit has been felt there and witnessed by even his daughter. So I'm not sure about the ham sandwich, though.
Yeah. Well, I mean, because Elvis did kind of start as more of a gospel blues country artist and then sort of transitioned into rock and roll.
So did Johnny Cash.
Yeah.
Well, Cash was.
Yeah.
I was going to bring
more
up Cash at
embraced.
some point because he's got his share of stories too.
Yeah. Johnny
Well,
Cash
he
was.
started out as gospel. That's what he wanted to do, and he just kept getting turned away and turned away.
Yeah. But I mean, Johnny
Mhm.
Cash was always kind of country. It was just he was embraced by rock and roll fans because his music is just so cool.
Well, it's the thing.
Yeah.
It's, especially in the older days. Now you think, it's country, it's this, it's that. But when you look at Elvis, when you look at, blues singers who wound up, there wasn't a big market for blues music, so they went and played country bars because some of the similar musical notes.
And the lines weren't as firmly drawn back then as far as genre. I mean, a lot of the stuff was still being created. So
Well, rock and roll was only just starting out at that time.
yeah,
And rock, of course, comes from blues.
it didn't even
Yeah.
have a name at some of that point in the 50s.
Right. Well, if you would have asked Elvis, at that time, he would have probably considered himself more of a country artist, if not a crooner. In the kind of Dean Martin era.
Yeah.
Basically, I read a book about Sam Phillips and Sun Records, and it really Elvis's music erupted in kind of this amazing. You want to talk about inspiration, and you want to talk about almost spirit possession. It came during a single recording session where Sam was really about ready to call it quits with Elvis. He just didn't seem to have it when he did other people's materials.
Yeah.
I mean, he did okay, but there was nothing original about it. And then he and his band started fooling around. It's exactly how he said it. Fooling about, I think, is exactly what he said. They were just joking around. And they came up with this new musical style that wasn't exactly country, wasn't exactly blues, wasn't exactly rhythm and blues, but was somewhere in between. And so what happened with Elvis is, for years, he was just so original that no one really wanted him, and yet everyone really loved him. So that was the amazing thing about rock music, and I think that it actually it reflects in a lot of rock spirituality too. Because if you look, I consider the difference between the country ghost stories and the rock ghost stories, I would say, is really kind of the outlaw mentality. And I look at rock music as outsider art. In other words, it's music from outside of the mainstream, and rock and roll goes through this continual process of bringing in outsiders and making them the mainstream. I mean, we talked a little bit about Robert Johnson in the Crossroads, and that is really a story of an artist's journey who is kind of exiled, and he comes back and he has totally new music, totally new spirit, soul, and it attracts people. And that's what when you talk about rock and roll ghost stories, what happens is you start realizing that they have the same mentality towards music as they do spirituality. So when rock musicians have ghost stories, they'll incorporate, Aleister Crowley shows up a lot in rock and roll.
Didn't a rock and
Eastern
roll guy
mysticism.
buy his house?
What's that?
Jimmy Page bought Aleister Crowley's house in Scotland for a while, didn't he?
Right. Boleskine House. And that is, for me, was one of the creepiest stories that I wrote about in Haunted Rock and Roll, which that place, Aleister Crowley bought it because he said it was the darkest house he's ever been in. It was dark even on the brightest summer day. And it's also near Loch Ness. There was rumored to be a decapitation in the house. There was I believe, a church on the property that was burned down, and several parishioners died. So that's a perfect example of really some ghost stories that rise above just ghost lore, because Jimmy Page had friends that would stay over at Bulliskin House and had their own encounters. And he's quick to add, because one of the fundamental problems about writing about, maybe Led Zeppelin or the Beatles and whatnot, as far as the supernatural, is, they were stoned a lot. So maybe it's just hallucinations. But Jimmy Page, when I wrote about Bulliskin House and read some of his interviews, he really went out of his way to say his friends that experienced this were completely sober, not on drugs, completely straight, when they experienced this stuff.
Yeah.
Well, knowing that, Crowley.
We're going to have a whole show on Crowley and rip him to shreds.
The Crowley show.
No.
The most, to use his own terms, the wickedest man alive when he was alive.
Right.
And the subject
and I
of a
think
very
what
cool
attracted
Ozzy
the
Osbourne song.
musicians to him was that he was an outsider.
Yeah.
I think that's really the kind of the revelation for me, was that, when you talk about Elvis, he came from the outside, Robert Johnson from the outside. The Beatles didn't come from London. They came from Liverpool, working class, never had a chance to make it. So I think that they always had this underdog mentality, this outsider mentality. So people like, Aleister Crowley maybe appealed to them, and this idea that they have always been outcast and they're not afraid to adopt outcast spiritualities too.
When you think about it, Crowley was a drug addict. He was, his sexual orientation was yes, please.
Yeah.
He
not unlike a lot of rock musicians.
A good distance before, he kind of embodied what we think of as the counterculture movement that so much of rock tapped into.
Yeah.
Without, he died in what, the 40s, 50s? He died before the heyday of that movement, but he is definitely an embodiment of those ideas.
Yeah, actually, it would probably been maybe the early 50s when he died. I'm not a Crowley expert, but as I might have mentioned, I just finished up a book on World War II ghost stories, and actually Crowley shows up in several of those.
He was a friend of Ian Fleming during the war, and there's even speculation that he was a part of British intelligence.
Exactly, and then with Haunted World War II, what I tried to do is step a little bit away from just the ghost stories, but I've also looked at some what I consider Fortean phenomena that occurred during World War II.
Well, there was a lot of occult elements in
I was thinking the Foo Fighters alone of Japan.
Well, there's the Nazis with all of their occult
insanity
trappings, and
the Gremlins during the Battle of Britain.
There's a lot of occult stuff.
Hitler himself wasn't actually really all that. I think we actually discussed this on an earlier show. He wasn't even that.
Hitler was very much a materialist.
No, it was mostly Himmler. Himmler was actually a really big occultist.
Actually, quite a few of the other higher
Hess was kind of he was into that.
It was like almost everyone but Hitler.
Well, except Goebbels. Goebbels was a real pragmatist too.
Although he definitely had a hero worship of Hitler.
Oh yeah. He he would go with whatever worked, but
as did I'm sorry. Go ahead.
The one thing that I discovered is that Hitler believed himself to be God.
Absolutely.
What happens is when you have these kind of ultimate narcissists, you realize there's not room there for any other being, any other God or anything. So I did when I started to write the book, I wanted to write about Nazis and the occult, thinking that Hitler would, be, there are several kind of legends about how he worshipped the spear of destiny and things like that. And I found that most of that was probably Allied, maybe Allied misinformation that was spread about him. He used those groups to get power, but once he got power, he didn't want any competing powers.
Exactly.
The one everyone thinks of, the Thule Society, he ran them out of Germany.
Right, and I think also they after. I think he also went after fortune tellers, and but what I found was that there really was, in certain pockets of England and certain pockets of Germany, there was this occult battle going on, and Crowley was in
the center,
self-admittedly. So who knows? But
it wasn't even until World War II
leading that effort.
It wasn't until World War II where like the oldest, like still in existence, essentially killed the witch law in England. It hadn't been used in 100 years. Churchill was the one who actually essentially kicked it out, going because somebody actually tried bringing somebody in, and was like right around World War II, and he's looking at the chart. He's like, "Get out of here!"
I know the last person tried for it under English law. They were actually engaged in legitimate illegal activity. They just didn't have a law that readily fit what the person was doing. I think it was actually it was a fortune-telling scam. And they used the witch law because they needed something to nail them with.
But they couldn't use it because it's like, this makes no sense. Why is this even still in the books? Because I think the entire case got tossed.
But as desperate as things got in World War II, it would not surprise me at all to think that some people somewhere in the government said, hey, you know what? let's tap some of these occult guys because it couldn't hurt. Let's try to cast spells against Hitler.
Ian Fleming, the author of James Bond, he was an actual British intelligence agent during World War II.
Christopher Lee.
As was Christopher. They knew they were actually friends.
Yeah.
But Fleming also knew Crowley.
Yeah.
And at several points suggested the British government hire him. Because knowing, there was a popular myth at the time that Hitler was big on astrology. Of course, we know he wasn't.
Right.
But Himmler certainly with his bizarre obsessions with the occult. So, as I understand it, Fleming wanted to hire Crowley to tell them what the German astrologers were telling Himmler and Hitler.
Yeah. Or at the very least, psychological warfare.
Yeah.
It's useful.
Yeah, there's some evidence of that, and that's what I found as well. A lot of stories going on about there, and it was just so tempting that I decided to. In fact, the original title of my book was Weird War II, but they decided to change it to Haunted World War II, which I think is a little easier to say. But
there's also a couple of books already called Weird War II, actually.
Oh, okay, yeah. Well, that would help then.
Well, that's
specifically, not in the same sense. The ones I'm thinking of are specifically games in the vein of Dungeons and Dragons, but they might have realized, wait, this is already being heavily used by several publishers we don't want to copy.
Yeah, actually, as somebody whose titles, my own book titles, tend to get replicated a lot because I'm not very original with my choice of titles.
Well, there's also
it's not a good thing. You want original titles. It makes it easier for people to find your book.
Well, even with the main title that you said, like Weird War II, it's like, honestly, that sounds like an alternative history.
Yeah,
novel
it sounds more like fiction.
Than anything, than an actual like report.
Everything else I know of by that name is alt history.
Yeah.
What if the Nazis were actually time travelers? What if the Nazis had zombies working for them? Whatever.
What if they actually had werewolves?
Yeah. Oh, that was another.
Yeah.
When we talk about Hitler, we can talk about his obsession with werewolves. He loved.
Well, werewolves was like their special forces.
Well, that was,
but the
Wolf
other
Slayer. He had Operation Werewolf. He had this thing with lycanthropy. Like he loved. Maybe it was just the symbolism of it, but he loved wolves and and werewolves.
Wasn't also like with a lot of German legends that that wolves in general, various kinds of wolves, were like a central focus of power and something to be feared.
There was that. I mean,
and Germany had its werewolves. I mean, werewolves specifically in Germany were usually born.
Yeah, so it has a very deep cultural significance. So Hitler knew how to use, the symbolism.
There wasn't a symbol out there that he didn't take advantage of, and it's the argument I've had more than once. It's Christians like to say Hitler was an atheist, and atheists like to say Hitler was a Christian. And I agree with you. I personally think the evidence comes down on Hitler worshipped Hitler.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, he thought he was a child of destiny.
I mean, I think I'd go so far as he thought it was a messianic figure.
Yeah, probably. Well, by the end, for sure.
Yeah.
Early on, maybe he started a little more humble, but by the end, he was full-blown
It's also the nature of sociopathy and psychopathy that they tend to be that extreme level of narcissist, and they think they're God.
Well, even when he was beginning, they pretty much put him up to the mic, if I remember correctly, was because he essentially was able to make whatever he was doing visceral to a crowd.
Yeah.
And it was essentially just a pull and a pull and a pull and it was almost like
pretty much the one thing he was good at.
Yeah, a lot of people think that he was that he became the foreman because he was like the Nazi Party's best speaker, which wasn't actually the case. If you look at the speeches, Goebbels was actually a much better speech maker. The problem was
delivery.
Yeah, it was the delivery. Hitler had that visceral emotion, whereas Goebbels was a more intellectual speech maker.
Hitler was a good rabble rouser.
Yeah,
he was good at getting people riled up, which is, like I said, pretty much in my opinion, his one strength, and a good understanding of how to manipulate people.
Yeah. I mean, he wasn't a bad politician as those things go.
But he was nothing essentially more than an orator.
He wasn't that good a politician. I mean, he lost the popular vote.
Oh yeah, but I mean, as far as turning, I mean, when you look at how many times he lost, but managed to turn those losses around, that's a smart operator.
No, we can get debates how much of that was him and how much were the various advisors.
Yeah, he did have capable people around him at the beginning.
Yeah.
But anyway,
back on topic. We're just about to the end of the hour. First, why don't we give the number out again in case somebody has a question before we let Matt go shortly. 609-807-2492, 609-807-2492. Again, folks, remember to please silence your stream if you're going to call in so we don't get the interference. Matt, so what books do you have coming out in the near future, and for that matter, published now? Anything you want to plug? Any upcoming appearances you're doing?
Well, I do no public appearances coming up. I would like to have more haunted rock and roll come out probably this spring sometime, and then probably in October I'll have Haunted World War II. And the other thing I'm starting to look into is my grandfather was a railroader. And, I'm from central Pennsylvania, near Altoona, which is, one of the railroad capitals of the world. And what I found is a lot of ghost legends and ghost stories that happen around railroads. So I'm collecting that and writing that book as well.
Well, memory serves, there's legends about people seeing Abraham Lincoln's funeral train.
Yeah, that's going to be one of them.
Well, the railroads have such history.
There's a railroad museum in Altoona that's uber haunted.
I may need to check that
there's
out.
Ghost stories of these brakemen, heroes that appear. So it's a lot of ghost lore, a lot of folklore, some ghost accounts. It seems like a fun subject to write about, and so I'm just going to go for it.
Anything with Casey Jones?
I think you should. Having gotten the chance to read Ghosts of Country Music, I like your writing style. I like your open-minded, skeptic approach. Just because, believe it or not, you need that skeptical mindset.
Yes.
Or if you believe everything you're told, you're going to get suckered, and it comes across.
Yeah. Well, and then you lose credibility.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, and the other thing that I found is that my readers are really super smart, and I certainly don't want to dumb the material down. And I certainly don't want them to yell at me and send me nasty emails. So I really do try to tell the story as best I can, and as in an open-minded way too. And I certainly, over the years, I would say that I bent more towards the skeptical side early on. And honestly, as I'm writing these things, I'm such a devil's advocate that I can go from skeptic to believer and everything in between, as I'm writing a single story. But when people come to me and they've had these experiences, and they look to me, I guess, as some way, I'm certainly not an expert on it, but, I can tell, from my training as a journalist that I have a pretty good detector of when people are being honest with me. Mm-hmm. And these people that come to me, they've had real experiences they can't explain. And they deserve respect, and they deserve their stories to be treated with respect. So that's kind of my bottom line. And I know that, there are skeptics who I call cynics who, if someone had a religious experience, you wouldn't make fun of them. At least I would. And for some of these people who have talked to me about the experiences they've had, it has changed their lives. And so that's what I try to get across when I'm writing about it. And I would say 9 out of 10 people that I talk to don't even want their stories in the book because they're afraid of the ridicule. And I think that's kind of problematic when we're trying to be honest about this phenomena.
I would agree. And it's a thing. I'm sure you get the ones that's like, okay, put me in the book, but don't use my name. Which is I understand the desire for privacy, and it's the commonality of the experience in my experience. Almost everybody I've ever met, and with exceptions, but even some of the more cynical skeptics I've met have that one experience they don't understand.
Yes,
there's a reason why there are enough people that don't believe in ghosts out there that if there wasn't some inherent fascination with the subject, I don't think TV shows like Ghost Hunters and or for that matter, this radio show would exist. I'm certain I've got listeners listening to me right now, knowing the numbers we get, that think I'm nuts. All the people you've talked to are nuts. None of this is real, but they're still listening. There's still something about the story that's fascinating.
If nothing else, it's entertaining.
Yeah.
Yeah. And to be fair, it's not like we've gotten that much hate mail or hate calls.
Only one.
I'm a little disappointed, to be honest.
Yeah, I know. We're not pushing enough buttons, obviously.
Give it time.
Right.
We will. But Matt, I think.
Well,
go ahead.
The other thing that I noticed is that after I wrote this feature story that really started this whole thing for me, the reaction. I think one of the reasons that led me to this was the reaction from just the reader in the street. When you're a writer for a small town newspaper, people just are always talking about what you just wrote. And usually you wrote about, sewage treatment plants and sewer pipes and all kinds of things like that. But when I wrote this feature story, I had so many people just come up to me off the street in stores and bars and tell me their ghost stories. And so I think it might be the mystery of life, which is what comes afterwards. And is there, so when you have that type of material that hits those types of levels, I think that makes the reason why you guys exist and why I write and all of it in between.
Those are where I think, interest in this kind of thing waxes and wanes over time. There's no denying that. But it never really completely goes away because, as you said, it is life's great mystery. And until we ever find an objective way of proving either that there is something on the other side or there isn't, it's always going to be a question. Heck, even if we objectively proved it, there are still people who think the world is flat.
Well, yeah,
somebody's always going to be asking.
Evolution's just a theory, and so is gravity, and it's like okay.
A lot of flat earthers don't even believe in gravity.
Yeah. I want to meet the people that don't believe in gravity.
They believe they don't believe they can fly. They believe that it's density.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Well, you could always say if you don't believe in gravity, you suck.
Oh.
Boom.
That's a good one.
I approve.
Yes, I'm gonna use that one.
But we've actually got a bit past the 7:30 mark. So Matt, I was going to let you go. Thank you again for coming back.
Yeah, very
It's a pleasure having you. As I've had the pleasure of saying to every guest we've had so far, consider yourself always welcome back here.
I appreciate that. I will do that. I'll listen to you guys. I had a
thank you. We
chat.
really appreciate
nice talking to you, and
yeah, especially when the next book comes out
in spring. I think we're going to have you back to talk about your next book in October, probably.
Yeah. Okay, sounds good.
Okay. Bye, Matt.
Have a good night.
Bye.
See ya. Thank you.
Okay, folks, that was Matt Swayne, author of Ghosts of Country Music and Haunted Rock and Roll, along with books about World War II and
upcoming,
more about Haunted rock and Roll, and for that matter, the ghosts of universities.
Yeah, very, very good.
I've read, I haven't read all of his books, but I have read Ghosts of Country Music. It's well written. It's a lot of fun. I do recommend people go check that out. It's a good book. And again, as Matt's saying, there is a folklore element to all of this, even if you think that we're all crazy.
It's fun. Yeah. Even if you're interested in just the music part, it's another dimension, pun intended, to add to your knowledge of various artists that you might not know.
Yeah,
I didn't know that thing about Jimmy
Page
Morrison or Jimmy Page.
Yeah, I was going to say Jimmy Page's connection to Aleister Crowley is interesting. Crowley's connections in World War II are interesting.
Yeah, I can't wait for the World War II one because
me either.
I've always had a thing for World War II.
Most of my grandfathers served in World War II. That's why I have a fascination with it. I know it, and it's an interesting war. And there's all sorts of things, and I mean, when you get into Himmler's crazy obsessions, when you get into the Aeronambi, is it? The branch of the SS that went out and tried to go find Atlantis and all the other.
Oh yeah, his little like occult research group that it was hilarious.
With the BS archaeology and all that.
Yep. Oh yeah.
Yeah. Keep in mind.
Pretty much the basis that gave
Indiana
us Raiders
Jones
of the Lost
is based
Ark.
on history.
Yeah, gave us Raiders of the Lost Ark and Indiana Jones. So
even the fourth movie, as bad as it was. Yeah, the Soviets had a fascination with the paranormal.
Oh yes, the Soviets did. I mean, all the mind control stuff. Well, hell, the CIA.
MK Ultra, Project Stargate.
I think everybody's main issue with Indiana Jones 4, though, was that they're doing aliens now. What the heck is this? And so, considering how much space travel and science fiction became a huge indent right around that time, and that was because
that was the idea. Was Lucas wanted to move the thing up to like the 50s rather than the 30s, and the emphasis of the 50s was the nuclear age, space travel, aliens, all of that. The problem was it was just kind of a misfire because honestly it just wasn't as cool as Indiana Jones fighting Nazis.
Supposed to be a passing of the torch as well.
Yeah, well that part was a mistake.
They're looking at an Indiana Jones 5 and Mud is not going to be in it at all.
No, Shia LaBeouf gone.
I like this character. I don't want to hear it.
Oh, he was weak.
Dude, fight me.
Okay.
I don't think he was a bad character, but I don't think he was a good fit. I'll put it like that.
Yeah. I didn't think he added anything. He was kind of bland and uninteresting. I mean, he was supposed to be like this sort of 50s greaser kid, but he didn't have any of the characteristics of like a greaser of the time. He was just really kind of a milquetoast. It's like if they had Indiana Jones' kid and he was like a real rebel and anti-authoritarian, didn't want anything to do with his dad and all that. That would have been cool.
My big issue with the movie is the way it kind of rocks the entire premise of the series back on its heels. Because, you get Indiana Jones and Raiders of the Lost Ark. It's the power of God. Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. It's the power of God. Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. It's the power of gods because it's the Hindu gods.
Yeah.
Although let's not even get into how much they mix up Hindu mythology.
Well, yeah, that movie had a lot of problems.
Yeah, no. Like, I remember because, especially that part towards the end where he's trying to, like, take Indiana Jones's heart out while they're, like, hanging down. I remember that vividly from when I was a kid, but now as I've gotten older and they're going on about, you know, how this ceremony is done and this and that, so I'm going, no.
Oh yeah, no, that
Brain
movie
damage.
Was not kind to Indian.
Well,
it wasn't researched properly.
To be fair, it's not even pretending to represent normal Hindu beliefs.
No,
it's supposed to be the Thuggee cult.
Yeah, it's playing it like
a
a pulp.
While the Thuggee cult was a real thing, and they murdered people, ostensibly in the name of Kali, of the goddess Kali. In reality, they mostly were thieves.
Yeah.
Well, there's that.
But
and
in their practice, traditional Thuggees didn't draw. You know, they strangled their victims to death with a red yellow sash. They wouldn't. It was very important to their religious practices to never draw blood.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, you don't offer a punctured thing up. At least for that region.
In particularly that deity. You don't offer her blood in that. You would never offer blood in that sense. The sacrifice really has more in common with Aztec and Mayan sacrifice than it does anything in Hinduism.
That's actually what I was going to be getting back to. And the thing is, for those kinds of sacrifices with the way they crossed it over, it's like there was really no other point than essentially just driving anybody who was underneath, I forget the character's name, whoever was under him, and that was it. Like there was no real purpose to it, to the actual ritual. It was just, how far can I break you mentally and have you just accept whatever I tell you to do? And it's like that's not the point of it. I'm done.
Also, Kali's a little complicated because Hindu deities often are.
Well, she was also a creation deity as well as
not exactly.
Structure.
Sort of.
No, she's a bouncing force.
Yeah.
Well, no, she's a destroyer. She is a killer, but she's specifically a killer of demons. What you run into, which is where it gets complicated, is that, and any Hindus who are listening, if I screw this up, I apologize. Feel free to call in and correct me. But as I understand it, there is the goddess Parvati, who is a goddess of creation, who is the wife of Shiva, the Lord of Destruction. Although Shiva is the Lord of Destruction, but he is not an evil deity in any sense of the word at all.
Right.
But something happens, and basically a rare aspect of Parvati came out, which was Kali. And Shiva had to eventually... originally, it wasn't destroying good. It was destroying evil. It was destroying demons. But she got out of control to the point that Shiva had to step in and get her to revert back to Parvati, or there was a real risk of her destroying the entire world. So she is a bit of an unbalanced force, but she's not evil.
Well, the thing is, it also depends on what was going on in the tumult of those times as well.
Yeah.
Kind of like how people will argue back and forth who is worshipped longer or anything like that, whether Set was always the off brother or anything like that. But if you go back far enough, he wasn't always the evil brother to Osiris or anything like that. So from what it sounds like, and this is just from your brief description, I have not honestly had much of a chance to look into Hindu deities myself, but from what I'm hearing, it sounds like the whole Sekhmet as the Eye of Ra becoming Bast issue where, somebody had to step in, but it's a matter of, did somebody actually have to step in? Or was there a cultural shift? And so things switched back and forth in between them. Do you understand what I mean?
Yeah, I get what you mean. And I honestly, I know a bit about aspects of Hinduism. The reality is Hinduism isn't one religion, it's a giant collection of them.
Yeah.
So it's really impossible to speak definitively about all of it. I think there's some logic to what you're saying, although I'd prefer to have someone who was more familiar with it than I am step in at this point, if possible.
Well, the other problem is they were trying to replicate the sort of pulp serials of the 30s, which as
played
a
fast and loose with history.
Yeah, and we're kind of racist. I mean, let's face it. Back then, they had no problem painting entire groups of people, yellow peril, all that sort of thing.
I thought Lucas did pretty well. I mean, there's definitely a point in the movie of, no, this is not normal. This is not.
Oh no, they weren't going out to be racist, but they were inspired by that kind of thing. So they weren't really concerned with painting an accurate portrayal of the religion.
There's the lines from Indy that, in my mind, help redeem it in that respect. Of you have disgraced Shiva.
Yeah,
it's like no, you have violated the tenets of your own Hindu belief system.
Exactly,
you're not in the right here. Yeah. And again, Shiva's always, of all the various deities of the world, Shiva's always fascinated me because he is a god of destruction, but it's an understanding of Hinduism having a very cyclic nature, cyclic view of reality, and to create requires a degree of destruction.
Well, it fits in with the whole. I mean, the reincarnation idea, the idea of things.
Something else. I'll just look at the most fundamental level. We die. Our bodies eventually decompose, which goes back to the plants, which gets eaten, and without death, this cycle can't happen.
Yeah, it's kind of the wheel of life.
Well, they also had something similar, and with Egyptians with the concept of Ma'at.
Yes.
Which is the cycle of seasons. And it was also by the same logic that essentially the plane that we're currently on, essentially the land we're on, this is the land of the living. Across the river over there is clearly the land of the dead. That's the divider. And if you go far enough, you're going to reach the other side. It was by this logic, even though they didn't have, at least not marked equations that we found yet, they had the logic that the earth must be round. But they also, everything had a cycle, everything had a place, and there was a certain way you had to go about it. And and
it was an Egyptian who first pronounced, for anyone who's going, it was an Egyptian philosopher that first suggested the world was round, as far as we know.
Yeah, that's oldest. It was I think it was first a Greek that proved it. Or
it was actually the librarian of
Eratosthenes. Actually did it with math.
The chief librarian of the Library of Alexandria.
Yes.
Yep.
Or Alexandria.
Great.
He's the one who actually proved the Earth is round,
and he did it with 2 sticks and math.
2 sticks and 2 completely different problems, because it was observing a stick and its shadow in a northern province of Greece, and then a much further south province of Greece, looking at the shadows cast, and then applying geometry.
Yeah.
And his estimate he gave a range of estimate for the diameter.
He wasn't far off.
The smallest estimate he gave was within 1% of the actual diameter of the Earth.
Yeah,
and this was in
smart guy.
This was 2,200 years ago.
Yeah.
There's even some debate about historians today if anyone ever really believed the Earth was flat.
Yeah, a lot of
until
people
today.
Think that, I mean, a lot of people think that was something that was made up and then applied to people. I mean, maybe Columbus thought the Earth was flat.
No, he didn't.
He was apparently an idiot. No,
he was an idiot. Oh no! Let's be
he has always been an idiot.
Clear.
Yeah.
Columbus was
racist,
a complete
vile
idiot, racist,
jerk,
violent, slave, trading
genocidal,
asshole. Idiot.
So, I had heard that he also thought the Earth was flat.
But he didn't think the Earth was flat.
No. The legend goes that he came up with the concept that the Earth was round and brought it to the King and Queen of Spain.
Which is also wrong.
Yeah, no. Everybody knew that the Earth was round. However, I think that with whatever the telling was...
Well, I know what actually happened. I've done a fair amount of research on this because history fascinates me. So... actually, he didn't think the Earth was round. He thought it was basically pear-shaped.
Which is even better.
This is a great mistake. And the reason that nobody wanted to give him money is that he grossly underestimated the diameter of the planet. And everyone knew it. Everyone looked at him, and it's like, you want to sail from Europe to Asia going the long way. You're going to starve to death.
Yeah.
And let's be clear. One, if you tried to sail basically, if the United States wasn't here, if it was basically a big ocean, and he just kept sailing from Europe this way, with the supplies he had, he would have starved to death.
Yeah.
In fact, he nearly did.
Yeah.
His crew was on the verge of mutiny when they found the New World, because of the fact that they had no food left. He had grossly underestimated the distance.
Yeah.
Columbus was factually wrong about something everybody at the time knew, but it wasn't that the Earth was flat; it was how big the world was.
Okay, so I misunderstood that part.
Okay, so here's the next question: how did he convince the King and Queen of Spain to give him the money?
Basically, nagged them.
Basically, they gave him the money to shut him up.
Go the hell away. Fine, here, take your stupid boats and go.
Take the 3 boats. Take a bunch of people who don't really want to run anyway. And go away.
Yeah.
Maybe you come back and bring us something we want. If not, you know what? We'll never see you again. And that's good too.
I think maybe they were hoping he would starve to death on the voyage.
Probably. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is Columbus, also known as probably the second craziest Italian guy after Napoleon in history in Europe. As a whole, that nobody wanted anymore.
Yeah. I will say a lot of why Columbus is so popular in the United States, you can thank Washington Irving for.
Yeah, which is...
And you can thank Italian Americans in general. Because what happened, it's become pretty well known at this point that when the Irish first came to the United States, they got dumped on by everybody.
Oh, yeah. Nobody wanted them around.
The same also was true of the Italians.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
The Italians were the odd men out. And actually for some of the same reasons as the Irish, because a big part of the problem that both Italian Americans and Irish Americans had coming into the United States is the U.S. throughout history has been a predominantly Protestant nation. I'm not saying that the government's... we're not a theocracy by any means, nor should we be. But most people that live in the United States have always been Protestant. Most U.S. presidents, with the definite exception of Kennedy, and possibly the exception of Lincoln, all of the U.S. presidents have been Protestants. We're a very Protestant nation by design, and Protestants hate Catholics. And the Irish and the Italians were predominantly Catholic. What happens is Irving had written a story about Columbus, and Italian Americans were able to go, wait. This dude, this Columbus guy, who discovered America, was one of us. So we're Americans too. And it helped them find a degree of acceptance here.
Yeah, and it was promoted for that reason, but it's unfortunate.
However, the BS legends of Molly Maguire before the whole Molly Maguire's group rumor mongering started really didn't help anybody who was Irish when they came over.
Oh, no.
True.
Everybody thought that they were, people that just didn't want to pay their taxes or contribute and just wanted to be lazy drunkards all day and have nothing but babies. And it's like, they kind of had no choice.
Well, they were also fleeing a devastating famine and horrible treatment in England.
Well, here's the thing with the famine. The famine was complete BS because the people shouldn't have starved. The problem was the only food products that the government was making available was potatoes because everything else that Ireland was growing was being outsourced or shipped
because
out.
the English hated the Irish and have always treated them
So this was even
horribly.
amongst because there were some territories, if I remember correctly, that were kind of on a lock and key, but weren't actually
there are parts of Ireland that are sort of English leaning.
So this makes me think of a philosophical thing I've been thinking about lately. Because and I have I'm going to start doing YouTube episodes as well as this. We're not stopping with the radio by any means, but I want to make more content, basically. And one of the first episodes I've got coming up is tentatively titled Popular Myths About Evolution.
Yes.
Specifically with the mindset of popular myths that creationists believe about evolution and the science behind them.
Nice.
And I'm actually working on I may be working on this with an atheist friend of mine from YouTube as well.
Cool.
But he and I are going to work on a project together. We're just trying to decide what he's away for the holidays.
Make some educational videos.
Yep. But what I find interesting here is I and most Christians are of the opinion that the book of Genesis is more of an allegory than a literal description of the creation of the world. So thinking about, what is it an allegory of? And one of the most basic concepts, in my opinion, in Genesis is, man was given a perfect world. Man disobeyed. And that's why we have famine and disease and death and all the horrible things that we have. Well, what's the allegory there? Part of what occurs to me is, you ever think about how much of the evil in the world, directly or indirectly, comes back to human mistakes? The most obvious example of my point being, we have enough food in the United States to feed our entire population.
Oh, yeah.
And children starve.
Mm-hmm.
It's not God that's preventing food that we physically have from going to people that need it.
There's more food that gets wasted and rots in the United States.
Yes.
Than
and that's true
need to feed like everybody.
The rich, all over the world, especially in dictatorships, you find this where they hoard it for their people and don't give it to the poor.
Well, scarcity creates opportunities.
How many children grow sick and even die of diseases like polio, which are easily preventable because their parents are afraid of vaccinations?
Well, an easy thing to take it out of that is think about like the AIDS epidemic in Africa. They could stop that. We have the medication. The drug companies will not give it to Africa because, God forbid, their profits should.
And of course, there's
suffer.
the utterly insane beliefs that some parts of Africa have about AIDS.
Well, there's that too.
Which is another.
But that's a whole other thing.
The idea of that having sex with a virgin child will cure your AIDS. It's one of the points I've seen made more than once. A lot of people let me be clear. There's plenty legitimate to criticize the Catholic Church about. The sex abuse scandal is the most obvious, is a huge, completely legitimate thing, and I'm not going to try to defend that. But there are other criticisms that are not fair, and one of the ones I've seen a good counterpoint to is people criticize the Catholic Church for not telling people in Africa to wear condoms. And when you're dealing with populations that think sex with a virgin will cure your AIDS, and it specifically has to be unprotected sex, the Catholic Church is telling them that's wrong. They're telling them not to do that.
Yeah.
If they don't listen when we say, don't have sex with virgin children,
they've got bigger
why
problems.
do you think they're going to wear a condom? Because the Catholic Church said so.
Yeah. No, unfortunately, that's a whole other kettle of fish. But there are so many problems with the world that you're right, that do simply trace back to greed or stupidity.
Yeah.
That, there's so
Even
many
a lot of the
problems that could be fixed if people just decided to fix them.
How many hurricanes and floods, the death tolls would have been minimized if people just got out of the way when they knew it was coming.
Oh, yeah. If people actually listened to the warnings of evacuate the area.
Or even environmentally speaking, like the whole Dust Bowl. The reason that happened was because of what
they wouldn't rotate crops.
Well, it wasn't the rotating crops. It was the irrigation system that screwed it over. The way that they were doing the irrigation was short range, good, but the thing is, with the way that everything was going, the rotating didn't help much either. But it didn't really have a chance for the soil to actually naturally settle, because they were the basic concept for it was, one, kind of poor to begin with. Again, it's good for short term, like if you need that extra boost, but it's not something you should be doing consistently, but because of how many actual water sources were nearby.
Yeah.
Now I wish Misha was up here. There's an incident that happened with communist China, where they came up with a new method of farming, which was revolutionary and helped, in a short term, help produce a lot of food. In the long term, it destroyed the ecosystem, and basically they overfarmed the land and did things like this. And part of what created a horribly, incredibly serious famine in China under Mao was that the government refused to acknowledge the system didn't work.
Well,
so you got entire villages disappearing overnight, people resorting to cannibalism because the government continued to prop up a system they knew didn't work because they didn't want to admit they were wrong.
Doesn't that sound familiar?
Yeah.
We've seen that happen a number. Hell, there are things that are still going on that don't work, that the government just doesn't, will not admit.
Never get edging into politics.
Yeah, we'll stop there because, we're going to
Kevin, you said you had a special treat for us tonight earlier.
Oh, yes, we got Ghost Box.
Yes.
So 2 weeks ago,
our very own Ghost Box.
Folks can remember that we talked to Chris Moon. Chris Moon is the author of the book Spirit Box, about a device inspired by Thomas Edison's radio to the dead. So guess what I got for Christmas?
I got a rock.
And
Wah,
so
wah.
it's not, sadly, it's not the one that Chris was talking about. But I did find one on Amazon.
That looks more like a walkie-talkie to the dead.
Yeah.
A little slimer, if you hear me.
And I thought, wouldn't it be fun to play with it a little and see what happens? Can you guys hear it? Or should I get a micro that's over by a microphone?
Probably should be a microphone. That way we can hear it over the headphones.
It doesn't have an input, does it, Kev?
It does have a microphone, headphone, and a spout input.
Put it in that wire there.
Oh, there might be a jack that you
That
could.
white wire right there.
This one?
There you go.
Okay, let's see what we can do here.
And now we don't hear nothing.
Neither do I.
Put the volume up.
Oh.
Okay, hold on.
There we go.
What the heck happened? Can you put it over here now?
Static before.
Yeah, it's on static, so we're good. So let's get this thing going and see what happens.
All good. All good. If something comes through,
We can up it.
you can boost it up.
Well, the thing is, what it basically does is it's going to cycle through radio stations, and we see what happens.
Oh, okay. We got to make sure it's a ghost.
So you actually do want to kind of turn it up, unfortunately, because
Oh, you can have that a little bit.
make sure it's a ghost and not a DJ in Princeton or something.
yeah.
So it's reading the frequencies, Kev? Is that what it's doing?
Yeah, it's flipping through frequencies at about 100 milliseconds per change. So that's what you're hearing. And the theory is that I can't promise anything, but we may get voices coming out of this. So I think we can just treat this like an EVP session. For those who haven't tuned in before with EVP, the way that this is going to work is I'm going to ask a question, we're going to let it run for a bit, and then we'll ask additional questions, and we'll see if we get anything. And now you can start to hear the music coming through. Now keep in mind, it's flipping channels about 100 milliseconds, at about the fastest rate it can go, so we shouldn't get anything too specific. So if there's any spirits here, why don't you give us a shout out?
It sounds vaguely like a techno beat. So.
It does a little.
Sort of like you could mix that.
It's the thing with EVP, you gotta keep your ears open. We're getting voices, but I think it's just stuff coming through from the channels. It's not exactly specific.
That's good, right?
Yeah, it's working.
That's good. That's what we want to hear.
So if there's any spirits here, come on, give us a sign. Say something. Say hello. What? Push a little harder. We're getting something, but we want you to be a little more specific here. Try fiddling with. Yeah, that's the problem with this kind of thing. Is the skeptic in me is always going, yeah, this is explainable so far.
Yeah.
I did just try upping the speed at which it's going, so let me try something else. Because basically, basically, I started us on the AM band, now I'm switching us to the FM. Or no, FM, now we're going to AM. At 200. Oh, so come on, if there's any spirits out there who want to say something, say hello.
Like I said, I think you cleared them all out.
It doesn't quite work that way with benevolent spirits. Though granted, the most powerful reactions we likely get are the less friendly ones.
Yeah.
And no, I don't want to I don't want to open the door on that front.
Now you go to that hotel.
Yeah.
Try the thing there.
And lo and behold, we'll wind up doing this maybe in a cemetery, maybe at that hotel that we'll be going to. Oh, definitely. And we'll see what happens. And we can try it again. Sometimes it's the night, and we may try this another night. It might work. Yeah, why not? Just say hello.
Hello.
Spook the chicken. There you go. If any spirits are listening in, see if you can say his name. That'd be a pretty clear sign. I have to admit I've used the effect of scanning through radio frequencies while on the radio. Yeah. This is a little meta, even for me. We're not getting a whole lot of response. Yeah, it could be it as well.
We are in a radio station.
Yeah. Okay, I think we're going to call this, because I don't think we're getting anything. I think different circumstances, different location.
Yeah, probably not the best place for
But,
an attempt,
yep.
but
That's
still fun that you got one, and we can talk about our Christmases. I spent my Christmas, like being sick to my stomach, laying on the couch all week.
That sucks.
That was fun. Yeah,
I've had
terrible.
an incredibly busy week actually, because I have my mom, sister, brother, and brother-in-law, and two nephews who I went to see Christmas Eve, and then Amisha's family on Christmas Day, and then Friday I got to go see my dad and his wife, and again my sister and everybody for Friday night, and then 30th I got a birthday party of a friend of mine, and then New Year's Eve I'm going to a big gaming thing all night.
Oh, nice. Oh, you know what? I have a question I wanted to ask you when we were doing our Christmas episode that we didn't get around to. There wasn't a good opportunity, but I'm guessing that we probably don't have a lot of small children in our viewing audience.
I would hope not.
I'm going to go ahead and fire this one off, but I've always wanted to ask this and talk with somebody about it. Do you think, because it's always seemed a little weird to me, like when kids are very young, we tell them all this stuff about, the world is magical and there's Santa Claus and there's reindeer and there's all this stuff. And we tell them, oh no, we swear it's true. It's, it's all this, we give them presents from Santa. And then suddenly, like as they get older, they get to a certain point, it's kind of like, no, sorry, that was all a bunch of crap. It was actually us. Yeah, there is no magic. Stop believing in magic. It's silly. Don't be childish. Like, as you grow up. And I've always wondered, what do you think of that, like the psychological effects of that? Do you think that messes with kids? Because I've always felt that probably screws kids up a little bit.
I think it'd be very good for kids. Although I think, I had a bit of a different situation growing up because I have 3 siblings and I'm the oldest.
Yeah.
So my parents didn't necessarily want to tell me Santa didn't exist, because then the oldest gets pissed off at his sister and decides to spoil it for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
But what I ran into is I worked it out for myself.
Yeah, I kind of did that too.
And I think on that way, those stories are very good for kids, because it's sort of, when you let it go properly, it's an exercise in critical thinking, and you let them figure it out for themselves. The thing that there's a bunch of studies, and not having prepared for this particular topic, I can't name the ones off of the top of my head.
For once, we're on equal footing.
Yeah, you guys should Google this and check it out for yourselves if you don't believe me. But there's a number of psychological studies that demonstrate that maybe there's exceptions, but for the most part, we're born into this world with a sense of, for lack of a better way of putting it, the other. The sense that some external mystical force exists and watches over our life. The evolutionists could argue that this is an inborn survival trait. One of the arguments that Richard Dawkins, I think, has proposed about religion is man evolved religion as a survival trait to cut once we became intelligent enough to be aware of our own demise.
Yeah.
And we needed some way of functioning with that knowledge. So it does serve a basic psychological purpose.
I could buy that.
But this is also why, when you look at kids, I mean, there's the paranormal explanation of this, but from a rational perspective, if you raise a kid without a belief in Santa and a belief in God, they're going to wind up believing in something. Monsters under the bed, demons, angels, ghosts, whatever the names will change, but there's still this common shared experience of another world. And from a psychological perspective, this could explain a lot of mythology and religion and folk tales and fairy tales, as it's tapping into this inherent need that we all have to believe in something external to ourselves. So I think giving them some structure to it, Santa Claus, the Easter Bunny, the Tooth Fairy, even to some extent the Boogeyman and the monster under the bed and the monster in the closet, there's some value in that because it shapes it into a direction, and you can we can and often do turn those into parables. Some of the classic stories of the Boogeyman doesn't just kill children, he kills naughty children. Behave, and he won't get you.
Yeah.
Santa Claus delivers gifts to good boys and girls.
Yeah.
And
Krampus punishes
the wicked. But even in modern U.S., where we don't talk about Krampus or Zwarte Piet or the other figures like that, there's still, if you're not a good child, Santa will give you a present. If you're a wicked child, you'll get a lump of coal.
Yeah.
It serves, and people can look at this and argue, and certainly they do with religion, that morality without this sense of do it or else is better.
Yeah.
But the thing I would point out here, there's two counter arguments I would make to that. With adults, the counter argument I would make is, while I agree doing things for an altruistic purpose, if you're doing it because you think it's the right thing to do, not because you think God will reward you, is better. I'd rather somebody act in a moral way because they think God is watching. If that's what's going to get them to act in a moral, if that's the only thing stopping somebody from being a murderer, let them have the belief. I'd rather them not be a murderer. Well, I'm not saying that works for even most people.
Well, that's true.
But I think there is a subsect of the population that has more violent tendencies that doesn't act on it because of this feeling. And the other thing you run into with very small children is up until, I forget the age, but up until a certain age, children essentially qualify as narcissistic psychopaths.
Yeah.
They have no inborn sense. We don't seem to be born with a sense of empathy, and certainly not with a sense of right and wrong. Kids usually do things or don't do things because of this fear that, if I'm bad, mommy will punish me. They don't understand, well, I should try to be a good kid, and that's not disrespecting children. That's just the way that the brain develops, and the parts of the brain that deal with morality and empathy take time to develop in humans.
Well, it's a higher abstract level of
because
thinking.
At that point, you're also arguing what would be the parenting method.
Yeah.
And I understand you're talking in generics.
Yeah.
And there are exceptions.
But
there are some kids that just seem to have an
age,
inborn sense of decency, but it's rare.
Up to a certain age, for the most part, it isn't anything to do with parenting. It's the reality of higher brain function and the way that it develops.
Well, below a certain age, all you are aware of is your needs. And so basically, you're hungry, you cry, someone feeds you. Okay, therefore crying is good. Crying gets me what I want.
And that goes on even a little longer to the point.
Yeah.
And this idea of Santa can give them a basic reason to behave themselves. While that greater sense of morality develops. the belief in God can do this for people. Well, it develops for people who have a lacking sense of morality, and also morality and God and evolution are really interesting topics in their own right.
Yeah.
There's certainly an ample amount of evidence, for example, that morality is a survival trait.
Oh, I agree.
Higher animals, chimpanzees, other socialized animals show signs of a basic ethical system.
Animals that cooperate with each other and have sympathy toward each other and whatnot usually do tend to survive better.
Yeah, and the evolutionary argument is that this is evolution at work. The religious argument is, well, the Bible said, the Christian religious argument specifically is that God writes a moral code on each person's heart. Again, because I love to stand in the middle against both sides, I don't think the two are mutually exclusive. I tend to see, we've talked about this before, but to fill our listeners in, I'm a very mechanistic Christian, I guess is the best way to put it. It's not deism, but where deism is the belief that God created the universe, set it up with a set of laws, and just step back and let it work. And there is a God, but there's no point in praying to him because he's not going to intercede. He's out of the picture. God has left the building.
If I was going to believe in any thing, that's probably where
this is what Thomas Jefferson believed. This is what Benjamin Franklin believed.
A lot of the founding
essentially
fathers.
the unmoved mover theory from Aristotle.
Yes, or it's also commonly called the watchmaker.
Yeah, or
hypothesis.
Yeah.
I'm not that, but what I believe is similar to that in that I tend to believe God created, he kickstarted the Big Bang in some way that we don't know yet. And if you want to ultimately know how he did it, look at the physicists that are trying to figure it out.
Yeah.
But I believe that he set a universe into motion with natural laws with an intention of creating a specific result. And then he let the universe run with the natural laws to give him the result that he wanted. I mean, with a all-knowing God that's aware of all of space and time, he's entirely capable of setting up the chain of events that would lead to the Big Bang, that would lead to the formation of galaxies, and planets, and stars, the formation of the building blocks of life that would become the first amino acids, that would form the first proteins, that become the first single-celled life. And again, to play the science advocate for atheists that are listening, I'm not saying that he magically, snapped his fingers and said a bunch of words and caused this to happen. I'm saying he did it through natural processes. But there's an idea. I'm loath to use the argument because I don't like where most creationists go with this. But there's this idea that if you have natural law, there's a lawgiver. It's like, I wouldn't put it that way, but God set the constants up of the universe in the way that it runs, and he lets natural order do the work for him. And again, I'm not saying he doesn't intervene, but I think even a lot of the ways that he intervenes has a natural explanation.
Yeah.
Because again, yes, God does commit miraculous events, but I think he does it in an economy of energy sort of way of, do I need to just break all the rules of the universe I just created to get the job done? Or can I set up a volcano that'll go off in 65 million years and or an asteroid that'll hit the planet that'll get what I wanted to done without having to break my own rules?
Yeah. Well, this is a big topic. Obviously, one of these days we'll have an episode where we're just going to sit and just fully hash out.
A lot of this is also going to be coming up in my upcoming YouTube episode about creationism, evolution, and why I don't think the two need to be mutually exclusive. And there's a lot of things there, and there are very good scientists who are devoutly Christian people, most of whom tend to view things more or less the way I'm laying out. One of the common creationist arguments is that, well, the Big Bang was created by atheists to get rid of the idea of God.
Well, no.
The Big Bang was created by a Roman Catholic priest.
Yeah.
And it drove the atheists up the walls.
Yeah.
And it was beautiful.
Yeah.
this is from the pagans saying this because
Well, also the brilliance that you have to respect Lemaitre for, and scientists do, is he looked at Hubble's observations of expanding universe.
Yeah.
Looked at Einstein's theory of relativity, and said, "Wait a minute." The existing theory at the time, which is known as steady state, was the universe is, the universe was, the universe always shall be, nothing changes. Which was great for atheists, because if the universe has no change, there's no beginning. If there's no beginning, there's no creation. And if there's no creation, there's no creator, therefore no God.
To an extent, but that even as a science, even with my limited knowledge of science, that would have sounded a little too convenient to me as far as everything has some sort of a beginning, some sort of a middle, sort of an end.
It does.
It's a cycle to everything.
The complaints people had towards Lemaitre in the beginning were they thought that his religious beliefs colored his work. Even Einstein, whose own theory of relativity works a lot better in the Big Bang universe model than it ever did in the steady state model. He later would admit this. When he met George Lemaitre, he said to George, your math is correct, but your physics is abominable. Because he had to be dragged kicking and screaming into admitting he was wrong about steady state. Hoyle, another very important 20th century physicist, believed steady state to his dying day in the 1990s.
Well, a lot of people.
But we found mountains of evidence that, the Big Bang is right. And it wasn't an atheist that... And again, I'm not saying this in any way validates Christianity as a scientific viewpoint. But it does completely demolish the belief that it was created by atheists to destroy Christianity. The man who created it was a devout religious man who never... And he didn't become an atheist. It's not like,
these are the
Darwin
same people
trained
that
to be a
believe
priest, and then he ultimately converted to agnosticism, not atheism.
I mean, these are some of the same people, though, that believe that evolution is this diabolical plan that's been set in motion for like 200 years, and we've been slowly planting all of these little fossils just so that we could quietly dig them up one by one and very, very tediously and slowly.
Well, I'll say...
I was like, none of this makes sense as a conspiracy theory.
Look out if you're not familiar with it, because he's one of the most interesting figures in modern science, in my opinion. Francis Collins.
Yeah.
Guy's the head of the National Institute of Health. He was the head of the director of the Human Genome Project in the United States. He's a very well-respected biologist. He was actually even, Christopher Hitchens, who was well known for his dislike of religious people, was good friends with the man. And Francis Collins is an evangelical Christian. This is not an atheist, but he is firmly on the side of religious people have to accept that evolution happens.
Yeah. Well, because, there's being religious, and then there's being just delusional. And I don't think that the two are not mutually exclusive. And
there are delusional religious people, and there are delusional non-religious people.
Exactly.
And I think a lot of creationists, at least the ones I've spoken to, it's less that they're delusional, it's that they've been lied to.
Well, yeah, but they also it's that intense.
They've been lied to by people they trust.
Yeah, and they don't want to hear anything else, and that's some of that is just people's natural bias.
True, and also it's very hard to break it when you're raised to believe. When mom and dad say the universe is 6,000 years old, grandpa says all of your friends say it. The church you grew up in says it.
Oh yeah,
it's hard to accept that it's wrong.
No, and that's one of the issues that I take actually with religion as a thing, is the sort of indoctrination that it imposes on someone's thinking that they really can't ever shake. And to me, that's kind of unfair to a kid to expose them to only one viewpoint. And I'm saying this to any religion or
true of atheism too, I would say. If raising anybody in a rigid "this is the way it is" mindset is not healthy.
No, and I would agree with that. I would say that what you're talking about is like scientism, where it's like science to the point where it's almost its own religion. We treat science as if it's a religion.
I hesitate to use the term just because it gets abused so much, but I would agree with you.
Yeah, and because to me, there's a difference between atheism scientism. So I like to draw that conclusion.
Well, the thing is, atheism is really it's a belief in a negative. It's not really a uniform belief structure, which is another mistake a lot of creationists make. It's like, well, atheists all believe in evolution. No, they don't. There are atheists that reject evolution. There are atheists.
Well, that would actually be more anti-theist. If you look at what the word actually means, anti-theist would be more what usually. Atheist actually means without theology.
The actual philosophical definition of atheist, I've heard this argument, but the actual proper meaning of the term atheist is someone who does not believe in God.
Right.
Or gods, I should clarify.
Right.
And the thing I run into with a lot of modern atheists is they like to use the term agnostic atheist, and I've heard many of them say to agnostics, "You're an atheist, just admit it." I disagree. I think the agnostic atheists are agnostics; they just need to admit it. And the agnostic position is, I don't know.
Yeah.
It literally means without knowledge.
Yeah.
The answer it is not I believe in God. It's that I don't believe in God. It's I don't know.
Yeah.
And the atheists will argue.
And honestly, I'd rather see more people just admit that. Just go with.
But I think,
you know what? We don't.
I think that's the thing. I think the majority of people, atheists and theists, and the fact that people don't understand this, I think, is a huge problem with our society. Are like, I don't know that God exists. I cannot objectively prove it.
Right. You believe.
I believe God exists.
Right.
There are atheists that say, well, I don't know that God does not exist, but because of a lack of evidence, I choose not to believe it until provided evidence to the contrary. It's like, well, okay, if that's your definition, then you're an agnostic atheist, and I'm an agnostic theist because I believe in God. I acknowledge there's no evidence.
Right.
And at that point, the distinction's meaningless.
Yeah. Well, it's that moderate thing where you have the reasonable people on both sides that can basically look at the issue and say, okay, you know what? There's really no strict evidence either way. You believe what you believe. I believe what I believe. We're gonna live and let live, and we're gonna try to be
start
cool.
wrapping this up.
Yes.
So
this is why I said we need a whole show for this.
You and Beth have been working on this. Do we have a guest scheduled for next week?
Not that I am aware of. So if we want to have a freeform,
I think that's going to be me. I'm claiming it. I want to be the first guest of the new year.
Okay. So Brian will be our first guest of the new year. Brian McKinley, author of Ancient Blood, Ancient Enemies, and Drawing Dead.
Yes.
Check all those out on Amazon, as well as our guest tonight, Matt Swayne's books, Haunted Rock and Roll and Ghosts of Country Music, all of which are available on Amazon. I want to remind you all you have been listening to HamiltonRadio.net.
Absolutely. Check us out. Follow us.
If you check us out, you can follow us on Facebook. You can find us on YouTube. There's a ton of videos that come from back before I got on radio, on the radio, that we put up the ones from radio, so you can check those out if you want to see. Like last week, when we had Chuck Lemon on, you can go check that out if you didn't see it and see him actually playing the bowls. If you have any money and you want to give us a hand, remember patreon.com/demonology, patreon.com/demonology, or if you prefer to use PayPal, just get in touch with me. KevinM.ParanormalEncyclopedia@gmail.com, KevinM.ParanormalEncyclopedia@gmail.com, or you can find me on Facebook. I am on Twitter. I almost never use it.
Yeah, me neither.
But also, I do want to say Happy New Year, ladies and gentlemen.
Yes.
Thank you so much for tuning in. Remember, this is Hamilton Radio, Channel 2. Have a good night and God bless.
Clear.